Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that'll make your morning coffee taste different forever. We're talking about skull cups. Yes, you heard that right. Human skulls carved into drinking vessels. And before you click away thinking this is just another weird history video, stick around because this story is documented, archaeological, and way more widespread than you think. Take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for some seriously twisted history, and subscribe if you want more stories that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always wild to see who's brave enough to learn about skull drinking at 2 a.m. Now grab your favorite mug, preferably one that's never been a human head, and let's journey into the documented history of when your choice of drinkware could literally be someone's face. Number 1. The shocking discovery. Picture this, you're an archaeologist in 1997, brushing dirt off what you think is just another old bowl in a cave in Turkey. The sun is beating down, your back aches, and you're probably wondering why you didn't become an accountant like your mother wanted. Then you realize what you're holding isn't pottery. It's a human skull, and it's been carved, polished, and shaped into a perfect drinking cup. This actually happened at Göbekli Tepe, one of the world's oldest temple sites. Dr. Julia Greski and her team found multiple skull cups dating back over 11,000 years. These weren't crude hack jobs either. Someone had taken serious time and skill to transform human heads into functional vessels. The skulls were carefully cleaned, the rough edges smoothed down, and the cranium shaped into bowls that could hold liquid. But here's what made archaeologists lose sleep. These skull cups weren't hidden away like shameful secrets. They were found in ceremonial areas, right next to other important ritual objects. That meant drinking from human heads wasn't some twisted individual hobby. It was an accepted, possibly sacred practice. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological world. Similar finds started emerging from other sites. Herxheim in Germany revealed skull cups from 7,000 years ago. Fontbregua Cave in France contained skull cups that were 6,000 years old. Gough's Cave in England yielded skull cups dating back 14,700 years, making them some of the oldest known examples of human skull modification. The British Museum now houses several of these ancient skull cups, including the famous Gough's Cave specimens. The craftsmanship is remarkable. The skulls were carefully shaped using stone tools, with evidence of repeated polishing and refinement. Cut marks show that the skulls were deliberately modified, not just picked up and used as is. What's particularly fascinating is the consistency across time and geography. The Gough's Cave skull cups show the same basic modifications found in much later examples. Removal of the facial bones, smoothing of the cranial edges, and careful shaping of the base for stability. This suggests that skull cup making wasn't just random violence. It was a skilled craft with established techniques passed down through generations. Carbon dating and chemical analysis revealed more disturbing details. Many of the skulls showed evidence of defleshing shortly after death, suggesting they were prepared while still fresh. Some skulls had cut marks indicating the brain was carefully removed, not just allowed to decay naturally. This was intentional preparation, not opportunistic scavenging. The skulls themselves tell stories about their former owners. Age analysis shows that most skull cups were made from adults in their prime, typically between 20 and 40 years old. Some showed evidence of healed injuries, suggesting they belonged to experienced warriors or survivors of violence. Others were completely unmarked, indicating they might have come from non-combatants or prisoners. DNA analysis of residue found inside some skull cups revealed traces of various liquids, water, fermented beverages, and in some cases, human blood. The presence of blood residue suggests these cups weren't just used for ceremonial water drinking. They were used for consumption of human bodily fluids, making the practice even more disturbing than simple skull cup usage. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of sophisticated prehistoric societies that routinely transformed human remains into functional objects. This wasn't desperation or primitive behavior. These people had other options for containers and chose skulls deliberately for reasons that we're still trying to understand. Modern forensic analysis has revealed additional unsettling details. Some skulls show evidence of being modified while their owners were still alive. Cut marks and drill holes that show signs of healing indicate that some unfortunate individuals were subjected to skull modification as torture or ritual preparation before being killed. The skull cups weren't just made from dead enemies. Some were made from people who were forced to participate in their own transformation into drinkware. Number 2. Skull cups and battlefields. When you think about ancient warfare, you probably imagine swords, shields, and maybe some dramatic last words. What you probably don't imagine is the post-battle crafting session where warriors turned their enemies' heads into personalized drinkware. But that's exactly what happened, and archaeological evidence proves it was more common than anyone wants to admit. The earliest documented battlefield skull cups come from Neolithic Europe, around 5000 BCE. Mass grave sites from this period show clear evidence of systematic skull removal and modification immediately following large conflicts. These weren't random acts of violence. They were organized, ritualized practices that turned battlefields into workshops for human head modification. Germanic tribes, particularly the Cimbri and Teutons, were documented by Roman historians as practicing battlefield skull collection. Strabo, the Greek geographer, wrote that Germanic warriors would drink from the skulls of their enemies during post-battle celebrations. Tacitus, the Roman historian, provided more detailed accounts of Germanic skull cup preparation, describing how warriors would clean and carve enemy skulls while the battlefield was still warm. Archaeological evidence from Germanic burial sites supports these written accounts. Warrior graves from the 1st to 3rd centuries CE contained skull cups alongside weapons and other battle gear. Chemical analysis of these skull cups shows residue from alcoholic beverages, confirming they were actually used for drinking rather than just ceremonial display. Celtic cultures practiced similar traditions. The Ulster Cycle, an ancient Irish epic, describes warriors drinking from the skulls of defeated enemies during victory feasts. Archaeological sites in Ireland and Britain have yielded skull cups with Celtic decorative patterns, showing that the practice was integrated into Celtic artistic traditions. The process of creating battlefield skull cups was surprisingly standardized across different cultures. First, the head was separated from the body immediately after death. Then the skull was cleaned, either by boiling or by allowing insects to remove the flesh. The jaw was typically discarded, and the cranium was carefully shaped using stone or metal tools to create a stable base and smooth drinking edge. Medieval chronicles provide additional evidence of battlefield skull collection. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions skull cups used by Viking raiders during their attacks on English monasteries. The Heimskringla, a collection of Norse sagas, describes multiple instances of kings and jarls drinking from enemy skulls during victory celebrations. What made battlefield skull cups particularly valuable was their provenance. A skull cup made from a famous enemy commander was worth more than gold. These cups came with documented histories, whose head they had been, what battle they were taken from, and what reputation their original owner had possessed. It was like owning a piece of sports memorabilia, except the memorabilia used to think and feel. The practical aspects of battlefield skull collection were grimly efficient. Warriors needed containers for drinking water and alcohol during campaigns. Clay pots could break. Metal cups were expensive and heavy. Skulls were durable, waterproof, and readily available after successful battles. They were also psychologically effective, serving as constant reminders of victory and intimidation tools for future conflicts. Some cultures developed specialized roles for skull cup preparation. Celtic armies included warriors whose specific job was skull collection and modification. These specialists traveled with the necessary tools and knew the proper techniques for creating functional skull cups under battlefield conditions. They were like military quartermaster specialists, except their supplies were human heads. The size and quality of a warrior's skull cup collection became a measure of their military success. A veteran warrior might own dozens of skull cups, each representing a different victory or defeated enemy. These collections were displayed during feasts, used to intimidate rivals, and passed down to sons as proof of their father's martial prowess. Battlefield skull cups also served as crude historical records. In societies without written languages, skull collections preserved memories of important battles, famous enemies, and significant victories. Each cup told a story that could be passed down through oral tradition, keeping alive the details of conflicts that might otherwise be forgotten. Number 3. The belief in absorbing strength. Now we get to the really disturbing part. Why anyone thought drinking from a dead person's skull was a good idea in the first place. The answer lies in beliefs about human essence, spiritual power, and the transferable nature of strength that were shared across multiple ancient cultures. The core belief was simple but profound. Human qualities could be absorbed through consumption. Not just metaphorically, but literally. Ancient peoples believed that courage, intelligence, fighting skill, and spiritual power were physical substances that could be transferred from one person to another through ritual consumption. The skull, as a container of the brain and the seat of consciousness, was considered the most potent source of these transferable qualities. This wasn't primitive thinking. These were sophisticated cultures with complex religious systems, advanced metallurgy, and organized governments. Their beliefs about essence transfer were as central to their worldview as germ theory is to ours. To them, drinking from a skull cup wasn't disgusting. It was scientifically sound spiritual technology. Tibetan Buddhist traditions provide the best documented examples of these beliefs. Tantric practitioners use skull cups called kapala in ceremonies designed to absorb wisdom and spiritual power. These weren't just any skulls. They were specifically chosen from individuals who had demonstrated particular spiritual achievements or mental capabilities during their lives. The skull of a wise teacher could transfer knowledge. The skull of a brave warrior could transfer courage. The Tibetan tradition is particularly well documented because it continued into modern times. Ethnographers and anthropologists have recorded detailed accounts of kapala preparation and use. The skulls were carefully selected, often from volunteers who donated their bodies for spiritual purposes. They were then prepared according to specific religious protocols, blessed by lamas, and used in ceremonies that could last for days. Archaeological evidence from Central Asian nomadic cultures shows similar beliefs. Scythian burial sites contain skull cups with residue from fermented beverages mixed with various organic compounds, possibly including blood or brain matter. Isotope analysis of these residues suggests the drinks were consumed during specific seasonal ceremonies, likely related to transferring the strength of defeated enemies to living warriors. Celtic Druids taught that the human head contained the soul, and that consuming anything from a skull would transfer some of that soul's power to the drinker. This belief was so strong that Celtic warriors would specifically target enemy leaders and skilled fighters, not just to eliminate threats, but to harvest their capabilities for future use. The absorption theory extended beyond individual strength to collective power. Some cultures believe that drinking from multiple skull cups during group ceremonies could create shared strength among participants. Warriors would drink from the same skull cups during bonding rituals, believing this created spiritual connections that would make them more effective as a fighting unit. Ancient Chinese texts describe similar practices among nomadic tribes along China's northern borders. These groups believed that drinking from the skulls of Chinese generals could transfer their strategic knowledge and military wisdom. Some skull cups were specifically reserved for use by tribal leaders before important military campaigns. The belief system was sophisticated enough to include hierarchies of skull value. Not all skulls were considered equally powerful. The skull of a coward was worthless or even dangerous to drink from. The skull of a wise leader was precious. The skull of an undefeated warrior was priceless. This created a complex spiritual economy where skull cups had varying values based on their provenance and the reputation of their original owners. Some cultures believed in skull cup degradation over time. The spiritual power contained in a skull would gradually fade unless the cup was regularly used and properly maintained. This meant that skull cup owners had to actively use their collections or risk losing their spiritual potency. It was like maintaining a battery charge, except the battery was someone's cranium. Medical texts from various cultures describe skull-based remedies for specific ailments. Persian physicians wrote about using skull cups to treat melancholy and mental disorders. Indian Ayurvedic texts mention skull cups in treatments for spiritual possession and evil eye curses. These weren't folk remedies. They were prescribed by trained medical practitioners who believed skull consumption could address specific health problems. The absorption beliefs were so strong that they influenced battlefield tactics. Warriors would sometimes spare particularly skilled enemies specifically to capture them alive and prepare their skulls properly. A skull cup made from someone who died in terror or despair was considered less potent than one made from someone who died bravely or defiantly. Number 4. Rituals of power. Strip away the Hollywood romanticism and medieval ceremonies were brutal, political, and often involved drinking from human skulls as the main event. These weren't casual dinners. They were carefully orchestrated displays of power where skull cups served as both religious objects and political weapons. The most thoroughly documented skull cup ceremonies come from Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, where the practice continued into the 20th century. Tantric rituals called chad involved monks drinking from skull cups while meditating on death, impermanence, and the illusion of the self. But these weren't just any skulls. They were carefully selected from individuals who had achieved specific spiritual accomplishments, donated their bodies willingly, or died under particular circumstances that made their remains spiritually potent. The preparation of ritual skull cups was elaborate and precise. Tibetan texts describe multi-step processes involving cleaning with sacred herbs, blessing ceremonies that could last for days, and specific consecration rituals that transformed ordinary human remains into sacred vessels. The finished kapala cups were often decorated with silver bands, precious stones, and intricate carvings that indicated their spiritual purpose and power level. Archaeological evidence from ancient Germanic and Celtic sites reveals elaborate skull cup ceremonies that combined religious worship with political demonstration. Ritual sites in Germany and France contain skull cups arranged in specific patterns around ceremonial fires, suggesting they were used during group ceremonies that involved multiple participants drinking simultaneously. Celtic Druids used skull cups during seasonal festivals, particularly Samhain and Beltane. Roman writers like Julius Caesar described Celtic ceremonies where participants drank from human skulls while reciting genealogies, tribal histories, and oaths of loyalty. These weren't just religious services. They were political gatherings where skull cup sharing reinforced social hierarchies and tribal bonds. Scythian burial sites provide evidence of elaborate skull cup rituals involving fermented mare's milk and possibly psychoactive substances. Chemical analysis of residues found in Scythian skull cups shows traces of cannabis and other mind-altering compounds, suggesting these ceremonies were designed to induce altered states of consciousness. Participants weren't just drinking from skulls. They were using skulls as delivery systems for ritual intoxication. Medieval European chronicles describe skull cup ceremonies among various warrior cultures. The Gesta Danorum mentions Danish kings drinking from enemy skulls during coronation ceremonies. The Historia Langobardorum describes Lombard nobles using skull cups during oath-taking rituals. These ceremonies served dual purposes: religious observance and political theater. The power dynamics of skull cup ceremonies were complex and carefully regulated. Who could drink first? Which skulls were used for which purposes? How much could each participant consume? These details weren't casual. They were established protocols that reinforced social hierarchies and political relationships within the group. Some ceremonies involved skull cups made from specific categories of people. Skulls from enemy leaders were used in political rituals. Skulls from foreign warriors were used in military ceremonies. Skulls from local criminals were used in judicial rituals. Each type of skull was believed to provide different types of spiritual or practical benefits to the ceremony's participants. Female participation in skull cup ceremonies varied by culture, but was often significant. Celtic priestesses used skull cups in fertility rituals. Germanic shield maidens participated in warrior ceremonies involving skull drinking. Tibetan female practitioners had their own skull cup traditions focused on wisdom transmission and spiritual protection. The timing of skull cup ceremonies was often linked to astronomical events or seasonal changes. Full moon ceremonies, solstice celebrations, and harvest festivals frequently involved skull cup rituals. The belief was that cosmic timing could amplify the spiritual power contained in the skull cups, making the ceremonies more effective. Group skull cup drinking created shared spiritual bonds among participants. Warriors who drank from the same skull cups during ceremonies believed they were connected by the spiritual essence they had consumed together. These bonds were considered stronger than family relationships and more reliable than political alliances. Some ceremonies involve hierarchical skull cup drinking, where participants consumed from skulls of different quality or power levels based on their own status within the group. Leaders drank from the most powerful skulls. New members received lesser skull cups. This system reinforced social structure while allowing everyone to participate in the spiritual benefits of skull consumption. The documentation of these ceremonies comes from multiple sources: archaeological evidence, written accounts by outside observers, and ethnographic records from cultures that maintained skull cup traditions into modern times. The consistency across different sources and time periods suggests that skull cup ceremonies were genuine, widespread practices rather than isolated incidents or exaggerated accounts. Number 5, from Vikings to medieval knights. Let's talk about the Vikings, because any discussion of drinking from human skulls has to include the culture that made it practically an art form. But here's what might surprise you: the skull cup tradition didn't die with the Viking Age. It evolved, spread, and found its way into the halls of medieval Europe's most Christian knights. The archaeological evidence for Viking skull cup usage is solid but limited. Most comes from burial sites in Scandinavia, where skull cups have been found alongside other grave goods. The Oseberg ship burial from 834 CE contained fragments of what appear to be skull cups, though preservation issues make definitive identification difficult. More conclusive evidence comes from the Birka archaeological site in Sweden, where several intact skull cups were discovered in warrior graves dating from the 9th to 10th centuries. Written sources provide additional confirmation. The Heimskringla, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, contains multiple references to skull cup drinking among Norse kings and jarls. While these texts were written centuries after the events they describe, they're based on earlier oral traditions and provide consistent accounts of skull cup usage in Viking culture. The transition from Viking to medieval European skull cup usage is documented through archaeological finds in Norman settlements. When Vikings settled in Normandy and later conquered England, they brought their skull cup traditions with them. Excavations at Norman castles in England and France have revealed skull cups dating from the 11th to 12th centuries, showing clear continuity with earlier Viking traditions. Medieval chronicles provide written evidence of continued skull cup usage among European nobility. The Gesta Hammerbergensis by Adam of Bremen mentions skull cup drinking among German nobles. The Chronica Slavorum describes skull cup usage among Wendyish tribes in northern Germany. These weren't fictional accounts. They were contemporary records written by educated clergy who witnessed these practices firsthand. The Crusade appear to have expanded skull cup traditions through cultural contact. Crusader accounts describe encountering skull cup practices among various Middle Eastern and Central Asian peoples. Some Crusaders adopted these practices themselves, bringing skull cups back to Europe as both trophies and functional objects. Archaeological evidence from Crusader sites in the Holy Land shows skull cups with mixed cultural influences, European metal decorations combined with Middle Eastern craftsmanship techniques. These hybrid skull cups represent cultural exchange at its most disturbing, showing how skull drinking traditions spread through military contact and conquest. Medieval knightly culture adapted skull cup traditions to fit Christian sensibilities, at least superficially. Instead of drinking from pagan enemy skulls, some knights used skull cups made from the heads of heretics, pagans, or enemies of the faith. This allowed them to maintain skull cup traditions while framing them as acts of Christian devotion rather than barbaric paganism. The persistence of skull cup usage in medieval Europe is documented through church records of condemnation and prohibition. If skull drinking hadn't been a real problem, the church wouldn't have spent so much effort condemning it. Papal letters, episcopal decrees, and synod records from the 12th to 14th centuries contain repeated prohibitions against skull cup usage, suggesting the practice was widespread enough to concern church authorities. Monastic chronicles provide some of the most detailed accounts of medieval skull cup usage. The Abbey of St. Denis records describe skull cups used by French nobles during political ceremonies. The Chronicle of Jocelyn of Brakelon mentions skull cups among the possessions of English lords. These monastic writers were educated, careful observers who had access to noble households and could document practices that might otherwise have been hidden. The evolution of skull cup traditions in medieval Europe shows how cultural practices adapt to changing religious and social contexts. The basic practice remained the same, transforming human skulls into drinking vessels. But the justifications, decorations, and ceremonial contexts evolved to fit Christian medieval society while maintaining the core elements of the tradition. Number 6. The nobles' dark collectibles. Medieval nobles collected many things: jewels, fine weapons, exotic animals, rare books. But some of their most prized possessions were collections of human skull cups, carefully curated displays of cranium-based drinkware that served as conversation pieces, status symbols, and functional dinnerware all at the same time. The best evidence for noble skull cup collections comes from inventory records kept by medieval households. These detailed lists, maintained for tax and inheritance purposes, occasionally mention skull cups alongside other valuable possessions. The inventory of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, includes references to cups wrought from the skulls of enemies, valued at significant amounts relative to other household goods. English manor records from the 14th to 15th centuries provide additional documentation. The household accounts of John of Gaunt mention payments to craftsmen for the adornment of skull vessels with silver and gold. These records show that skull cups weren't just functional objects. They were luxury items that received the same decorative attention as fine jewelry or ceremonial weapons. Archaeological excavations at medieval castle sites have uncovered elaborate skull cups that confirm the documentary evidence. Warwick Castle excavations revealed skull cups decorated with precious metals and gemstones. Caerphilly Castle in Wales yielded skull, cups with intricate engravings and metalwork that were required skilled craftsmen to complete. The craftsmanship involved in creating noble skull cups was remarkable. Medieval artisans developed techniques for lining skull cups with precious metals to prevent bone contamination of the contents. They created intricate mounting systems that allowed skull cups to be displayed when not in use. Some skull cups were fitted with hinged lids, decorative handles, and elaborate stands that transformed them into centerpiece objects for noble dining halls. Noble skull cup collections weren't random accumulations. They were carefully planned acquisitions that reflected the owner's military achievements, political connections, and personal interests. Some nobles specialized in collecting skull cups from specific types of enemies: foreign nobles, rebellious vassals, or defeated tournament opponents. Others focused on skull cups with particular aesthetic or historical significance. The most elaborate skull cup collections belong to royal families. The crown jewels inventories from various European kingdoms include references to skull cups, among other ceremonial objects. These royal skull cups were often used during coronation ceremonies, state dinners, and diplomatic meetings where they served as both functional objects and symbols of royal power. Female nobles maintained their own skull cup collections, often focused on skulls from female enemies or rivals. The inventory of Isabella of France, Queen of England, mentions skull cups decorated with feminine motifs and used during ceremonies specifically involving noble ladies. These collections show that skull cup culture wasn't exclusively masculine. Medieval noble families developed elaborate protocols for maintaining and displaying their skull cup collections. Special servants were assigned to clean and preserve the skull cups. Specific rooms were designated for skull cup storage and display. Family genealogies sometimes included information about famous skull cups and how they were acquired, treating them as important family heirlooms. The value of noble skull cup collections is documented through inheritance disputes and legal records. Medieval court cases sometimes involved arguments over skull cup ownership, with heirs claiming rights to specific skull cups based on their historical significance or monetary value. These legal documents provide concrete evidence that skull cups were considered valuable property worth fighting over in court. Trading and gifting of skull cups between noble families served diplomatic purposes. Marriage negotiations sometimes included skull cups as part of dowries or bride prices. Political alliances were sealed with exchanges of particularly prestigious skull cups. These transactions were recorded in diplomatic correspondence and marriage contracts, showing that skull cups functioned as both personal possessions and political currency. The decline of noble skull cup collections corresponds with changing medieval attitudes toward death, Christianity, and social respectability. As church influence grew stronger and courtly culture became more refined, skull cups gradually transformed from functional objects to historical curiosities. Many noble families donated their skull cup collections to monasteries or buried them with deceased family members rather than continuing to use them. Number 7. The Church's outrage. The medieval Catholic Church had opinions about everything. What you ate, when you ate it, who you married, how you married them, and definitely what you drank from. When church authorities discovered that their supposedly Christian nobles were hosting dinner parties using human skulls as dinnerware, the reaction was swift, horrified, and largely ineffective. The earliest church condemnations of skull cup usage appear in episcopal letters from the 8th century. Bishop Boniface, the Anglo-Saxon missionary to Germania, wrote extensively about the diabolic practices of Germanic converts who continued using skull cups despite their Christian baptism. His letters to Pope Gregory III describe elaborate efforts to convince newly converted nobles to abandon their skull cup collections in favor of proper Christian chalices. Papal decrees specifically prohibiting skull cup usage appear throughout the medieval period. Pope Nicholas I issued a bull in 863 CE condemning the practice among newly converted Bulgarian nobles. Pope Gregory VII Dictatus Papae includes references to skull cups as examples of practices incompatible with Christian faith. These weren't casual mentions. They were serious theological statements that equated skull drinking with devil worship. The Church's opposition wasn't just moral. It was practical. Skull cups represented alternative spiritual authority that competed with Christian sacraments. When nobles drank from skull cups during important ceremonies, they were essentially practicing non-Christian religion while claiming to be faithful Catholics. This undermined church authority and suggested that Christian rituals weren't sufficient for all spiritual needs. Monastic chronicles document the church's struggles with skull cup culture among the nobility. The Chronicle of Matthew Paris describes conflicts between church authorities and English lords who refused to abandon their skull cup collections. The Annals Britanniani record similar disputes in France, where bishops threatened excommunication for nobles who continued practicing skull cup rituals. Some clergy attempted theological compromises that would allow limited skull cup usage within Christian contexts. The writings of Thomas Aquinas include discussions about whether skull cups could be acceptable if they were properly blessed and used only for communion wine during private masses. These theological exercises show how seriously the Church took the skull cup problem, how difficult it was to completely eliminate the practice. Archaeological evidence from medieval monasteries reveals an interesting contradiction. While church authorities officially condemned skull cups, some monasteries maintained collections of them, apparently for educational or meditational purposes. The Abbey of Cluny inventory from 1245 includes skull vessels for contemplation of mortality, suggesting that even religious institutions found ways to incorporate skull cups into their spiritual practices. The Church's anti-skull cup campaigns used every tool available: sermons condemning the practice, refusal of sacraments to skull cup users, threats of excommunication, and even physical destruction of skull cup collections. Some bishops organized skull cup burning ceremonies where confiscated collections were publicly destroyed as demonstrations of Christian triumph over pagan practices. Despite these efforts, skull cup usage persisted throughout the medieval period, often moving underground or adapting to avoid church detection. Nobles developed coded language for discussing skull cups, hidden storage systems, and private ceremonies that couldn't be easily monitored by church authorities. What had been public displays of power became secret traditions maintained within trusted circles. The Church's struggle with skull cups reflected broader tensions between Christian doctrine and medieval reality. The Church preached peace, forgiveness, and respect for human dignity. Medieval society was built on violence, vengeance, and the complete dehumanization of enemies. Skull cups were just one symptom of this fundamental contradiction. Some religious orders took more extreme approaches. The Cistercians developed alternative ceremonies using blessed chalices that were designed to provide the same psychological benefits as skull cups without using human remains. The Franciscans preached against skull cup usage as part of their broader reform movement targeting noble excess and pagan survivals. The most creative church response was the development of substitute practices that satisfied skull cup desires without using actual human remains. Specially blessed chalices, meditation with skull replicas made from clay or wood, and ceremonies involving symbolic consumption of enemies through bread and wine provided alternatives that were technically Christian while still addressing the psychological needs that skull cups had satisfied. Number 8. Legends of invincibility. Every culture that practiced skull cup drinking developed legends about warriors whose skull cups granted them supernatural powers in battle. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were serious beliefs that influenced military tactics, warrior training, and the entire approach to combat in skull cup cultures. The most well-documented legends come from Tibetan sources, where certain kapala cups were believed to grant specific supernatural abilities to their users. The Bon tradition, Tibet's indigenous religion, includes detailed accounts of skull cups that could make warriors invisible to enemies, grant them supernatural strength, or protect them from weapons. These legends were recorded in religious texts and passed down through oral tradition for centuries. Central Asian nomadic cultures developed elaborate legends about skull cups that could predict battle outcomes. Mongolian chronicles describe skull cups that would change color before battles, warning their owners about impending danger or guaranteed victory. Warriors who possessed these prophetic skull cups were said to never lose battles because they could always choose the right time and place to fight. Archaeological evidence supports some aspects of these legends, though not the supernatural elements. Warrior graves containing skull cups often show evidence of remarkably successful military careers, multiple weapons, extensive battle injuries that healed, and burial goods that indicate high status and wealth. While this doesn't prove the skull cups were magical, it suggests that skull cup owners were often exceptionally successful warriors. Celtic legends describe skull cups that could grant their users the ability to understand enemy languages, see through battle formations, and anticipate enemy movements. The Ulster cycle includes stories of heroes whose skull cups allowed them to communicate with dead warriors and receive tactical advice from beyond the grave. These legends influenced Celtic warrior culture for centuries. Germanic tribes developed legends about skull cups that could transfer not just the strength of defeated enemies, but their specific combat skills. A skull cup made from an expert archer could grant archery abilities. A skull cup from a master swordsman could transfer blade techniques. These beliefs led to strategic targeting of specific types of warriors during battles. The legend of invincibility often included specific requirements for maintaining skull cup power. Some traditions required daily use of the skull cups. Others demanded regular blessing ceremonies. Many legends included warnings about skull cup power fading if the cups weren't properly maintained or if their owners became cowardly or dishonorable. Ethnographic records from cultures that maintained skull cup traditions into modern times provide insights into how these legends functioned. Anthropologists working with Tibetan communities in the early 20th century documented skull cup legends that were still actively believed and practiced. These accounts show how legends about skull cup power shaped behavior, influenced decision-making, and provided psychological benefits that could translate into real-world advantages. The psychological mechanisms behind skull cup invincibility legends are well understood by modern researchers. Warriors who genuinely believed their skull cups made them invincible fought with greater confidence, took greater risks, and intimidated enemies more effectively. Whether the power was real or imagined, the results were often the same. Skull cup warriors developed fearsome reputations. Some legends included specific stories about skull cup failures, usually attributed to improper preparation, spiritual contamination, or moral failings on the part of the user. These cautionary tales serve to reinforce the importance of proper skull cup maintenance and appropriate behavior among skull cup owners. The most persistent legends involved skull cups made from undefeated warriors or legendary heroes. These skull cups were said to grant complete invincibility until their power was either exhausted through overuse or transferred to new owners through specific rituals. Some of these legendary skull cups were tracked through historical records for centuries, passing between different owners and cultures. Number 9. Skull drinking and medicine. Medieval medicine was already a nightmare of bloodletting, herbal poisoning, and treatments that were often worse than the diseases they were supposed to cure. But for some ailments, physicians had a special prescription that would make modern doctors faint. Drink your medicine from a human skull. This wasn't folk medicine or superstition. This was documented medical practice prescribed by university-trained physicians who believed skull cups could enhance the healing properties of various treatments. The medical theory was based on medieval understanding of anatomy and the belief that human skulls retained spiritual and physical essences that could be therapeutically beneficial. The most detailed documentation comes from medieval Persian medical texts, particularly the works of Avicenna and his followers. Persian physicians prescribed skull cup treatments for melancholy, epilepsy, and what they called spiritual disorders. The skull had to come from someone who had died in a specific way: violently for treating cowardice, peacefully for treating anxiety, young for treating aging-related ailments. Chinese medical texts from the Tang and Song dynasties describe skull cup treatments used by physicians treating nomadic tribal leaders. These treatments were prescribed for battle injuries, mental disorders, and spiritual possessions. The skulls were prepared according to specific protocols and combined with traditional Chinese herbs and minerals to create therapeutic beverages. European medical schools included skull-based treatments in their curricula. The Medical School of Salerno, one of medieval Europe's most prestigious medical institutions, taught skull cup therapy as a legitimate treatment option. Student physicians learned how to evaluate different types of skulls for medical use, how to prepare them properly, and how to determine appropriate dosages for various ailments. The medical preparation of skull cups was more complex than their ritual counterparts. Medical skulls had to be cleaned with specific herbs that were believed to enhance their therapeutic properties. They were often soaked in medicinal solutions, blessed by physicians, and tested for spiritual purity before being used to serve healing potions to patients. Different medical traditions use skull cups for different purposes. Islamic physicians in medieval Spain prescribed skull cup treatments for mental illness, believing that the skull's former owner's sanity could be transferred to mentally ill patients. Jewish medical texts describe skull cup treatments for spiritual protection and divine healing, though these practices were controversial within Jewish communities. Medieval European physicians developed specialized skull cup treatments for specific social classes. Noble patients received skull cups made from the heads of other nobles, peasant patients used skull cups from common criminals, and clergy used skull cups from executed heretics. The medical theory held that skull cups worked best when there was social compatibility between the skull's original owner and the patient. Female physicians and healers, working outside the formal medical establishment, developed their own skull cup traditions focused on women's health issues. These practitioners used skull cups for treating fertility problems, difficult childbirths, and female-specific spiritual ailments. Their techniques were often more sophisticated than those used by male physicians, incorporating detailed knowledge of anatomy and herbal medicine. The effectiveness of skull cup medicine is impossible to evaluate using modern standards, but medieval medical records suggest that some patients did experience improvements after skull cup treatments. Modern analysis suggests this was likely due to placebo effects, the healing properties of herbs and medications consumed from the skulls, or coincidental recovery, rather than any special properties of the skull cups themselves. Medical skull cup usage declined gradually as medical knowledge advanced and alternative treatments became available. The development of better surgical techniques, more effective medications, and improved understanding of disease causation made skull cup treatment seem increasingly primitive and unnecessary. Number 10. The creepy legacy. So where are all these skull cups now? What happened to thousands of years of human head-based dinnerware traditions? The answer is simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. Many of them are sitting in museums, private collections, and archaeological storage facilities around the world, waiting for visitors brave enough to learn about humanity's strangest drinking habits. The British Museum houses one of the world's largest collections of documented skull cups. Their prehistoric collection includes skull cups from Gough's Cave that are nearly 15,000 years old, making them some of the earliest known examples of human skull modification. The museum also owns examples from various European archaeological sites, though many are stored in research collections rather than public displays. The Smithsonian Institution maintains an extensive collection of Tibetan Kapala cups, many acquired during 19th and early 20th century expeditions to Tibet. These skull cups are remarkably well preserved and show the sophisticated craftsmanship that went into their creation. Silver inlays, precious stone decorations, and intricate carvings demonstrate that Kapala cups were considered valuable religious objects worthy of significant artistic investment. European archaeological museums contain skull cups discovered during excavations of medieval sites. The Museum of London has skull cups found during construction projects in the city's medieval districts. The National Museum of Denmark houses skull cups from Viking-era sites across Scandinavia. These institutional collections provide concrete evidence that skull cup usage was widespread and persistent across multiple cultures and time periods. Private collectors still maintain skull cup collections, though modern examples are typically replicas or skulls acquired through legal medical supply channels. The ethics of collecting human remains have changed dramatically, making authentic historical skull cups extremely rare and valuable. Auction records show that documented skull cups can sell for tens of thousands of dollars when they appear at prestigious auction houses. Modern forensic analysis of museum skull cups continues to reveal new information about ancient skull drinking practices. CT scans can show internal modifications that aren't visible from external examination. Chemical analysis of residues can identify what substances were consumed from the skull cups. DNA analysis can sometimes determine the geographic origins of the skulls and the relationships between skull cup makers and their raw materials. Contemporary archaeologists regularly discover new skull cups during excavations around the world. Recent finds in Mongolia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe have extended the geographic and temporal range of skull cup cultures. These discoveries show that skull drinking traditions persisted much longer and spread much further than previously documented. The academic study of skull cups has evolved into a specialized field within archaeological anthropology. Researchers now focus on understanding the cultural context that made skull drinking acceptable, the technical skills required for skull cup production, and the social functions these objects served in their original societies. Graduate students write dissertations about skull cup decoration techniques, spiritual significance, and cross-cultural variations. Museum education programs now include skull cup collections as examples of cultural practices that seem alien to modern sensibilities, but were normal and acceptable in their original contexts. These exhibits challenge visitors to consider how their own cultural practices might seem equally strange to people from different times and places. The skull cups serve as windows into mindsets that are simultaneously foreign and recognizable. Digital preservation efforts are creating detailed 3D models of skull cups that allow researchers to study them without handling fragile originals. These digital collections are being shared between institutions worldwide, creating virtual skull cup databases that enable comparative analysis across different cultures and time periods. Future researchers will be able to study skull cup traditions using tools and techniques that current archaeologists can only dream about. The legacy of skull drinking appears in unexpected places throughout modern culture. Gothic literature and horror fiction frequently reference skull cups as symbols of ancient evil or forbidden knowledge. Fantasy role-playing games include skull cups as magical items that grant special powers. Heavy metal and dark electronic music communities use skull cup imagery as symbols of rebellion against conventional morality. Modern neo-pagan and occult communities have attempted to revive skull drinking traditions, usually using animal skulls or synthetic replicas rather than human remains. These contemporary practitioners argue that skull cup rituals can provide spiritual benefits and connections to ancient wisdom, though their practices are typically symbolic rather than literal attempts to absorb power from deceased enemies. The psychological appeal of skull cup legends persists in modern contexts. Military units sometimes adopt skull-based symbols and imagery that echo ancient skull cup traditions. Extreme sports enthusiasts and competitive athletes sometimes use skull symbolism to represent their willingness to risk death for victory. The core appeal of skull cups consuming your enemies and absorbing their power translates into modern contexts, even when actual skull drinking is no longer practiced. Archaeological research into skull cup cultures continues to expand our understanding of ancient warfare, spirituality, and social organization. Each new discovery adds details to the picture of how these practices functioned, who participated in them, and why they persisted for so long across so many different cultures. The skull cups aren't just artifacts. They're textbooks written in bone that teach us about human nature in its rawest form. The most unsettling aspect of skull cup legacy is how normal these practices once were. For thousands of years, across dozens of cultures, drinking from human skulls was considered routine, honorable, even sacred. People who would never dream of eating with dirty utensils thought nothing of sipping wine from someone's cranium. The practice was so deeply embedded in warrior culture that its absence, not its presence, would have seemed strange. Today, when we look at skull cups in museums or read about them in academic papers, we're looking at artifacts from a world that understood death, power, and human relationships in fundamentally different ways. These cups represent a time when consuming your enemies wasn't metaphorical, when absorbing strength wasn't psychological, when drinking from a human skull wasn't horror. It was just Tuesday. The skull cups remind us that human nature is far stranger and more adaptable than we usually admit. They show us that people are capable of normalizing almost anything if it serves their survival, status, or spiritual needs. And they force us to consider what practices from our own time might seem equally barbaric to future generations looking back at our artifacts with the same mixture of fascination and disgust. In the end, skull cup drinking disappeared not because people suddenly developed better moral sensibilities, but because they found better ways to achieve the same goals: intimidating enemies, bonding with allies, demonstrating status, and gaining psychological advantages in competitive situations. The skull cups became unnecessary, not because the human desires they serve vanished, but because civilization developed more sophisticated methods for meeting those desires. The skulls now rest in museum cases, behind glass, with little plaques explaining their historical significance. Visitors read about skull cup culture with morbid curiosity, grateful to live in times when their drinking vessels have never had faces. But the skull cups are still there, still watching, still reminding us that the distance between civilization and what we now consider barbarism is often just a matter of what each culture calls normal. And sometimes late at night in those quiet museums, you might wonder, if you live in those times, in that world, with those beliefs and pressures, would you have thought drinking from a skull was strange? Or would you have just reached for your preferred enemy's head and poured yourself a drink? The skull cups don't judge. They just wait, holding their secrets, reminding us that history isn't just about dates and battles and kings. Sometimes it's about the small, horrifying details that show us who we really are when everything we consider civilized falls away. Sometimes it's about the moment when someone first looked at a human skull and thought, you know what? That would make a great cup. That moment, multiplied across centuries and cultures, created a tradition so widespread and persistent that museums now dedicate entire research projects to understanding it. The skull cups are no longer functional, but they're still teaching us something important about human nature, about the things we're capable of when survival, honor, and spiritual power are at stake. So if the next time you raise a glass, remember the skull cups. Remember that for thousands of years, people raised glasses that used to be faces. And maybe, just maybe, be grateful that your morning coffee comes in something that's never been anyone's head. Because the alternative, as our ancestors knew very well, was always available for those brave enough to drink from it. We've traveled through 15,000 years of documented history, from the caves of prehistoric Europe to the monasteries of medieval Tibet, following the trail of one of humanity's most persistent and disturbing traditions, drinking from human skulls. What started as an archaeological curiosity has revealed something profound about human nature, about the lengths people will go to gain power, and about how quickly the unthinkable can become normal. When Dr. Julia Gresky first held those polished skull fragments at Göbekli Tepe, she wasn't just discovering ancient artifacts. She was uncovering evidence of a human practice so widespread and persistent that it challenges everything we think we know about moral progress and cultural evolution. The skull cups she found weren't isolated incidents or products of desperate times. They were examples of a tradition that spanned continents and millennia. The sheer geographical spread of skull cup discoveries is staggering. From the frozen caves of England to the desert sites of Turkey, from Tibetan monasteries to Germanic burial grounds, skull cups appear wherever archaeologists look carefully enough to find them. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence of something fundamental about human psychology, something that made drinking from skulls seem logical, beneficial, even sacred to people across vastly different cultures and time periods. Consider the technological consistency. Whether we're looking at 15,000-year-old skull cups from Goff's Cave or 500-year-old Kapala cups from Tibet, the basic modification techniques remain remarkably similar. The skulls are cleaned, shaped, and polished using methods that show remarkable consistency across time and space. This suggests that skull cup making wasn't random violence or desperate improvisation. It was a developed technology with established best practices that were somehow transmitted across cultures that had little or no contact with each other. The archaeological record also reveals the social context in which skull cups functioned. They appear in elite burials alongside precious metals and rare objects, indicating high status and value. They're found in religious sites next to other sacred artifacts, showing their spiritual significance. They appear in domestic contexts as everyday objects, demonstrating how normal skull drinking had become in the cultures that practiced it. But perhaps the most unsettling archaeological revelation is the evidence of skill and care that went into skull cup creation. These weren't hasty battlefield conversions of enemy heads into makeshift containers. Many skull cups show evidence of multiple modification sessions, careful planning, and artistic decoration that would have required substantial time and effort. Someone cared enough about these objects to make them beautiful, functional, and durable. The preservation of skull cups in museum collections allows us to study them with modern scientific techniques that reveal details their creators never intended to preserve. Microscopic analysis shows tool marks that indicate the specific techniques used in their creation. Chemical analysis reveals what substances were consumed from them. DNA analysis sometimes identifies the geographic origins of the skulls and their relationships to the cultures that modified them. Each skull cup represents an individual human life that was ended and transformed into an object for someone else's use. The archaeological evidence forces us to confront the reality that these weren't just abstract historical practices. They were personal tragedies multiplied across thousands of years. Every skull cup in every museum case was once someone's head, someone's thoughts, someone's identity. The dating of skull cups also reveals something troubling about human consistency. The practice didn't evolve or improve over time. A skull cup from 15,000 years ago serves the same function and represents the same beliefs as one from 500 years ago. This suggests that whatever psychological needs skull cups satisfied remained constant throughout human history, only changing when cultural and technological developments made alternative solutions available. Modern archaeological methods continue revealing new aspects of skull cup cultures. Ground-penetrating radar has identified potential skull cup burial sites that haven't been excavated yet. Satellite imagery has revealed landscape patterns that might indicate skull cup ceremonial sites. As technology advances, we're likely to discover even more evidence of how widespread and sophisticated skull drinking traditions actually were. The archaeological record forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The people who created these skull cups weren't fundamentally different from us. They had the same cognitive abilities, the same emotional ranges, the same capacity for love, creativity, and moral reasoning that we do. The difference isn't in human nature. It's in the cultural context that shaped how that nature was expressed. Beyond the archaeological evidence lies a deeper question. What psychological mechanisms made skull drinking appealing to so many different cultures for so many thousands of years? The answer reveals disturbing truths about human nature and our relationship with death, power, and dominance that persist even in modern contexts. The core psychological appeal of skull cups appears to be rooted in magical thinking about power transfer. Humans have a deep psychological need to believe that strength, courage, and capability can be acquired rather than just developed through practice. Skull cups provided a concrete mechanism for this belief, allowing people to literally consume the essence of powerful enemies and incorporate their abilities into themselves. This isn't as primitive as it might seem. Modern athletes still engage in ritualistic behaviors designed to absorb or channel the power of successful competitors. We wear the jerseys of winning teams, collect memorabilia from successful people, and engage in superstitious behaviors that are psychologically similar to skull drinking, just without the actual human remains. The underlying psychology, the desire to absorb external power, remains constant. The Skull Cup tradition also reveals human attitudes toward death that are radically different from modern Western perspectives. In Skull Cup cultures, death wasn't the end of a person's usefulness. It was a transformation that could be harnessed for the benefit of the living. The Skull Cups represent a worldview where mortality was integrated into daily life rather than hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. This integration of death into life may have provided psychological benefits that modern death-avoidant cultures lack. By regularly drinking from Skull Cups, people were forced to confront mortality on a daily basis. This constant reminder of death's presence might have made them more appreciative of life, more willing to take meaningful risks, and more capable of accepting loss when it occurred. The social psychology of Skull Cup usage is equally revealing. Skull Cups served as conversation starters, status symbols, and bonding mechanisms that created shared experiences among group members. People who drank from Skull Cups together shared something that outsiders couldn't understand, creating in-group solidarity and out-group intimidation that strengthened social cohesion. The competitive aspects of Skull Cup culture reveal human tendencies toward one-upmanship and status competition that persist in modern contexts. Warriors competed to acquire the most impressive Skull Cups, just as modern people compete to acquire the most expensive cars, the largest houses, or the most prestigious job titles. The objects change, but the underlying status competition remains remarkably consistent. The gender dynamics of Skull Cup cultures also provide insights into how power and violence were understood in ancient societies. While skull drinking was often associated with male warrior culture, women participated in significant ways as collectors, ceremonialists, and creators of Skull Cup traditions focused on female-specific concerns. This suggests that the appeal of Skull Cups wasn't limited to masculine psychology, but addressed broader human needs for power, control, and spiritual connection. The persistence of Skull Cup traditions despite religious opposition reveals something important about the relationship between official culture and personal psychology. Even when authorities condemned skull drinking, people continued practicing it privately because it satisfied psychological needs that approved alternatives couldn't address. This pattern repeats throughout history whenever official culture conflicts with deeply embedded psychological drives. The gradual abandonment of Skull Cup traditions shows how cultural change occurs when alternative solutions become available for meeting the same psychological needs. People didn't stop wanting to absorb enemy power or confront mortality. They found new ways to address these desires that were more socially acceptable and practically effective than drinking from human skulls. Understanding the psychology behind Skull Cup cultures helps explain why these practices were so persistent and widespread. They weren't arbitrary cultural quirks or products of primitive thinking. They were sophisticated responses to universal human psychological needs that found expression through the cultural tools available in pre-modern societies. The Skull Cup tradition forces us to grapple with one of the most challenging questions in anthropology and moral philosophy. How do we judge practices from other cultures and time periods that seem obviously wrong to our modern sensibilities? The Skull Cups represent a test case for cultural relativism, moral progress, and the universality of human rights. From a strict cultural relativist perspective, skull drinking was simply one valid way among many for humans to organize their spiritual, social, and practical lives. The cultures that practiced skull drinking weren't inherently inferior to ours. They were different, operating under different circumstances with different knowledge and different cultural tools. Judging them by our standards is as unfair as judging us by theirs. This perspective has merit. The archaeological evidence shows that Skull Cup cultures often achieved remarkable things. They built sophisticated monuments, developed complex religious systems, created beautiful art, and maintained stable societies for centuries. The fact that they drank from human skulls doesn't negate these achievements or prove that they were morally inferior to modern cultures. But cultural relativism has limits, especially when it comes to practices that involve clear harm to individuals. Every Skull Cup represents someone who was killed, whose remains were desecrated, whose human dignity was violated in ways that most modern people find unacceptable. Can we really say that these violations were just different cultural choices with no moral implications? The Skull Cup tradition also reveals tensions between individual rights and collective practices that persist in modern contexts. In Skull Cup cultures, individual rights to bodily integrity after death were subordinated to collective needs for spiritual power, social bonding, and cultural continuity. Modern human rights frameworks would clearly condemn these practices, but were those frameworks available or practical in the historical context where skull drinking developed? The evolution away from Skull Cup practices suggests that moral progress is possible, even if it's not inevitable. Cultures abandoned skull drinking not just because of external pressure, but because they developed better ways to meet the psychological and social needs that Skull Cups had served. This implies that some cultural changes represent genuine improvements rather than just different choices. However, the replacement of literal skull drinking with symbolic alternatives raises questions about whether we've actually eliminated the underlying psychology or just found more socially acceptable ways to express it. Modern cultures still engage in ritualistic consumption of enemies through economic competition, political campaigns, and social media destruction of reputations. We've sublimated skull drinking rather than eliminated it. The Skull Cup tradition also challenges comfortable assumptions about moral progress and cultural evolution. If sophisticated cultures with advanced technology and complex social organization could normalize drinking from human skulls for thousands of years, what does that say about the stability of our own moral convictions? How confident can we be that our current practices will seem acceptable to future generations? The religious dimensions of Skull Cup usage complicate simple moral judgments. Many Skull Cup practices were genuinely spiritual, designed to honor the dead, connect with divine forces, or achieve enlightenment through confrontation with mortality. The fact that these spiritual goals involve practices we find horrific doesn't necessarily invalidate the sincerity or value of the spiritual seeking involved. The medical usage of Skull Cups presents additional moral complexities. Medieval physicians who prescribed Skull Cup treatments were trying to heal their patients using the best knowledge available to them. Their methods were wrong by modern standards, but their intentions were benevolent. How do we balance judgment of their methods against appreciation for their goals? The Skull Cup tradition ultimately reveals that human moral intuitions are far more culturally variable than we usually admit. Practices that seem obviously wrong to us seemed obviously right to people with different cultural backgrounds and life experiences. This doesn't mean all moral judgments are relative, but it does suggest that moral certainty should be tempered with humility about the cultural specificity of our own convictions. Perhaps the most important moral lesson from Skull Cup history is the recognition that humans are capable of normalizing almost anything if it serves their perceived survival needs, social requirements, or spiritual goals. This capacity for moral adaptation is both terrifying and necessary. It allows humans to survive in diverse environments and circumstances, but it also enables practices that cause tremendous suffering. The Skull Cups remind us that moral progress requires constant vigilance, critical examination of cultural practices, and willingness to change course when evidence suggests that current practices cause unnecessary harm. They also remind us that moral judgment should be balanced with cultural understanding and recognition of the circumstances that shaped historical practices. As we sit in our comfortable modern lives, sipping coffee from ceramic mugs and reading about Skull Cups on our smartphones, it's tempting to dismiss these practices as relics for humanity's dark past. But the psychological impulses that drove skull drinking haven't disappeared. They've just found new expressions that are more socially acceptable, but reveal the same underlying human drives. Modern military cultures still engage in practices that echo Skull Cup traditions. Soldiers collect enemy equipment as trophies, take photographs with defeated enemies, and engage in ritualistic behaviors designed to demonstrate dominance and absorb enemy power. The methods are different, but the psychology is remarkably similar to what drove ancient warriors to drink from Skull Cups. Corporate culture has developed its own versions of consuming defeated enemies. Business leaders talk about eating the competition, crushing rivals, and absorbing market share in language that directly parallels Skull Cup psychology. Hostile takeovers involve literally consuming enemy companies and incorporating their assets, employees, and capabilities. The Skull Cups have been replaced by merger documents, but the underlying drive to consume enemies remains constant. Social media has created new platforms for ritualistic consumption of enemies through public shaming, cancel culture, and viral humiliation. The digital mob doesn't drink from skulls, but it does engage in collective consumption of targeted individuals' reputations, careers, and social status. The Skull Cups have been replaced by screenshots and hashtags, but the group psychology of destroying and consuming enemies remains remarkably similar. Athletic competition provides another outlet for Skull Cup psychology. Fans wear the colors of winning teams, collect memorabilia from successful athletes, and engage in ritualistic behaviors designed to absorb team strength and success. Sports merchandise serves psychological functions similar to Skull Cups, tangible objects that allow people to feel connected to power and victory they didn't personally achieve. Academic and intellectual cultures have their own versions of Skull Cup consumption. Scholars build careers by critically dissecting the work of previous thinkers, essentially consuming their intellectual remains to strengthen their own positions. Academic conferences can resemble ritualistic feeding frenzies where established scholars collectively consume younger or weaker colleagues through public criticism and professional demolition. The entertainment industry has thoroughly incorporated Skull Cup imagery and psychology into popular culture. Horror movies, video games, fantasy literature, and heavy metal music all draw on Skull Cup symbolism to represent power, rebellion, and the consumption of enemies. These cultural products allow modern people to experience Skull Cup psychology vicariously without engaging in actual skull drinking. Modern occult and neo-pagan communities have attempted to revive Skull Cup traditions using ethical alternatives like animal skulls, synthetic replicas, or donated human remains from medical sources. These contemporary practitioners argue that Skull Cup rituals can provide spiritual benefits and connections to ancient wisdom, though their practices are typically symbolic rather than literal attempts to absorb power from defeated enemies. The medical establishment has largely abandoned skull-based treatments, but vestiges of Skull Cup psychology persist in alternative medicine. Some practitioners still believe that consuming substances from human or animal remains can provide healing benefits. These beliefs echo medieval Skull Cup medicine, while adapting to modern contexts and legal restrictions. The psychological appeal of Skull Cup legends continues to influence modern thinking about power, strength, and personal transformation. Self-help literature often uses language that mirrors Skull Cup psychology, absorbing the habits of successful people, consuming knowledge from experts, incorporating the strategies of winners. The Skull Cups have been replaced by books and seminars, but the underlying belief in transferable power remains popular. Military historians and strategists still study Skull Cup cultures for insights into psychological warfare, group cohesion, and the role of ritual in combat effectiveness. Some modern military training programs incorporate elements inspired by Skull Cup traditions, shared hardship experiences, ritualistic bonding activities, and symbolic consumption of enemy capabilities through intelligence gathering and tactical analysis. The Skull Cup tradition also influences modern approaches to death and mourning. While we no longer drink from human skulls, we still engage in ritualistic consumption of the deceased through memorial objects, inherited possessions, and symbolic activities designed to maintain connections with the dead. We've sanitized the process, but the underlying psychology of incorporating the dead into the lives of the living remains active. Contemporary neuroscience provides insights into why Skull Cup practices were psychologically appealing. The human brain's reward systems respond positively to ritualistic behaviors that symbolize power acquisition, group membership, and dominance over enemies. Skull Cup drinking would have activated these same neural pathways that modern people experience through competitive activities, status consumption, and group ritual participation. The study of Skull Cup cultures has also influenced modern understanding of cultural transmission and the persistence of traditional practices. Anthropologists use Skull Cup traditions as case studies for how cultural practices survive religious opposition, technological change, and social evolution. The Skull Cups provide a model for understanding how deeply embedded cultural practices can persist even when their original context disappear. As we reach the end of our journey through the dark history of Skull Cups, we're left with artifacts that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, cultural adaptation, and the thin lines that separate civilization from what we now consider barbarism. The Skull Cups sitting in museum cases around the world aren't just historical curiosities. They're mirrors that reflect aspects of human psychology that we prefer not to acknowledge. They show us that the capacity for normalizing violence, for treating human remains as functional objects, for finding spiritual meaning in death and domination, exists within all human cultures under the right circumstances. But the Skull Cups also demonstrate human capacity for change, growth, and moral evolution. The fact that we now find skull drinking horrific, rather than normal, suggests that cultural progress is possible, even if it's not inevitable. The same humans who once drank from enemy skulls also created art, music, literature, and institutions that enriched human life. The capacity for both horror and beauty exists within the same species, often within the same individuals. The archaeological record of skull cup usage spans nearly the entire history of human civilization. From the earliest evidence of complex human societies to the edge of the modern world, skull cups appear wherever we look carefully enough to find them. This persistence suggests that skull drinking addressed fundamental aspects of human psychology that transcended specific cultural contexts. Yet skull cup traditions did eventually disappear from most cultures, replaced by alternative practices that met the same psychological needs without requiring human remains. This transformation shows that cultural evolution can eliminate harmful practices when better alternatives become available and when social conditions support change. The study of skull cup cultures has contributed to modern understanding of archaeology, anthropology, psychology, and human behavior. These artifacts continue to generate new research questions, scholarly debates, and insights into how humans adapt to different environmental and social circumstances. The skull cups are still teaching us, even centuries after they were last used for their original purposes. The ethical questions raised by skull cup collections remain unresolved. Museums struggle with how to display human remains respectfully while educating the public about their historical significance. Indigenous communities sometimes request the return of skull cups that were acquired during colonial periods. Academic researchers debate the ethics of studying human remains that were obtained without consent and used in ways their original owners never intended. The skull cup tradition also highlights the importance of preserving difficult histories rather than sanitizing them for public consumption. These artifacts force us to confront aspects of human behavior that we'd rather ignore, but understanding these aspects is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in contemporary contexts. The skull cups serve as warnings about what humans are capable of under certain circumstances. Modern conflicts, environmental challenges, and technological changes may create conditions that test our current moral frameworks in ways that parallel the circumstances that shaped skull cup cultures. Understanding how previous generations adapted to extreme circumstances, for better and worse, can help us prepare for challenges that may require difficult choices about human dignity, survival, and cultural values. The skull cups ultimately remind us that moral progress is fragile and requires constant maintenance. The cultural evolution that led to the abandonment of skull drinking wasn't inevitable and isn't necessarily permanent. Under different circumstances, with different pressures and different cultural tools, humans might develop practices that seem equally horrific to future generations. But there's also hope in the skull cup story. The same adaptability that enabled skull drinking also enabled its abandonment. Humans can change, can recognize when practices have become harmful, and can develop better alternatives that meet their psychological needs without causing unnecessary suffering. The journey from skull cups to coffee mugs represents genuine moral progress, even if that progress is incomplete and potentially reversible. The skull cups are silent now, locked away in climate-controlled storage facilities and displayed under museum lights. But they continue to speak to anyone willing to listen to their message about human nature, cultural adaptation, and the ongoing challenge of building societies that channel human psychology toward beneficial rather than harmful ends. As you go about your daily life, drinking from normal cups and living in a world where human remains are treated with respect and dignity, remember the skull cups. Remember what they tell us about human adaptability, about the cultural specificity of moral intuitions, and about the constant work required to maintain civilized behavior in the face of psychological impulses that never completely disappear. The skull cup tradition ended, but the humans who practiced it were our ancestors, our predecessors, people with the same brains and the same basic psychology that we have today. The difference between us and them isn't in human nature. It's in the cultural context that shape how that nature is expressed. And that difference, fragile and contingent as it is, makes all the difference in the world. The skull cups are artifacts of our past, but they're also warnings about our future. They remind us that human moral progress is an achievement that requires conscious effort to maintain, and that the psychological impulses that drove skull drinking remain active within modern human nature, waiting for circumstances that might make them seem reasonable again. That's the final lesson of the skull cups. Vigilance. Not just against external threats, but against the internal psychological forces that made our ancestors think drinking from human skulls was a good idea. Because those forces are still there, still waiting, still capable of finding new expressions if we're not careful about the cultures we create and the practices we normalize. The skull cups are empty now. Let's keep them that way. Let's step back and consider what we've actually learned. The skull cup tradition wasn't confined to one culture, one time period, or one type of society. It appeared independently across multiple continents, persisted for thousands of years, and involved some of history's most sophisticated civilizations. From Neolithic cave dwellers to Buddhist monks to medieval knights, the practice of drinking from human skulls crossed every boundary we typically use to categorize human societies. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. Museums worldwide house thousands of documented skull cups spanning millennia. The British Museum's Goff's Cave specimens, the Smithsonian's Tibetan Kapala collection, and countless archaeological finds from Europe, Asia, and beyond all tell the same story. For most of human history, drinking from skulls wasn't aberrant behavior. It was normal. But what does this tell us about ourselves? What does it mean that our ancestors, people with the same brains and basic psychology that we have today, could not only accept but embrace the practice of turning human heads into dinnerware? The answer is both simple and terrifying. Humans are incredibly adaptable to their circumstances, and what we consider normal is largely determined by what our culture tells us is acceptable. Think about the progression we've traced. It started with practical considerations. Skulls were durable, waterproof, and available after conflicts. But it evolved into something much more complex, a system of beliefs about power, spirituality, and human essence that influenced warfare, medicine, religion, and social structure. The skull cups became nodes and networks of meaning that shaped how entire societies understood life, death, and power relationships. The spiritual beliefs surrounding skull cups reveal something crucial about how humans cope with mortality and violence. Instead of simply discarding the remains of enemies, these cultures developed elaborate systems for incorporating death into life, for transforming defeat into power, for making the horrific serve practical and spiritual purposes. The skull cups weren't just containers. They were technologies for processing trauma and converting it into strength. The medical usage of skull cups shows how desperate humans become when facing illness, and how willing they are to embrace treatments that seem logical within their cultural framework. Medieval physicians who prescribed skull cup medicine weren't sadistic or stupid. They were applying the best knowledge available to them, using theoretical frameworks that made sense within their understanding of anatomy, spirituality, and healing. Their mistake wasn't moral. It was scientific. The Church's opposition to skull cups reveals the tension between established religious authority and persistent cultural practices. The fact that church condemnation was largely ineffective shows how deeply embedded skull drinking was in medieval European culture. People were willing to risk excommunication rather than abandon their skull cup traditions, suggesting these practices serve psychological and social needs that Christian alternatives couldn't fully satisfy. The legends and stories surrounding skull cups demonstrate humanity's need for narratives that make sense of power, success, and survival. Whether or not skull cups actually provided supernatural benefits, believing they did provided real psychological advantages that could translate into better performance in combat, leadership, and social competition. The legends weren't just entertainment. They were functional belief systems that helped people navigate dangerous environments. The persistence of skull cup traditions across such vast spans of time and geography suggests they addressed fundamental human psychological needs. The desire to consume enemies, to absorb their strength, to transform defeat into victory. These impulses appear to be basic components of human psychology that found expression through skull drinking when cultural conditions permitted it. Modern humans like to think we've evolved beyond such practices, but have we really? We still consume our enemies, just differently. We devour their reputations through social media. We absorb their assets through economic competition. We transform their defeats into our victories through career advancement and business success. The methods have changed, but the underlying psychology remains remarkably similar. The skull cups also force us to confront uncomfortable questions about moral progress. Were the people who drank from human skulls inherently more violent or morally inferior to us? Or were they simply expressing universal human impulses through the cultural tools available to them? If we had grown up in their societies, with their beliefs and pressures, would we have found skull drinking equally acceptable? The answer is probably yes. The archaeological record shows that skull drinking wasn't practiced by particularly violent or primitive societies. It was practiced by the same humans who created art, developed writing systems, built cities, and established complex social institutions. They weren't monsters. They were people adapting to their circumstances, using the cultural resources available to them. This raises disturbing questions about our own moral certainties. What practices that seem normal and acceptable to us today will future archaeologists discover with horror? What objects will they find in our ruins that will make them question our humanity and wonder how we could have normalized such behavior? The skull cups remind us that moral progress isn't inevitable and that cultural practices we consider barbaric were once as normal to their practitioners as our own behaviors are to us. The skull cup tradition also reveals something hopeful about human adaptability. When circumstances changed, when better alternatives became available, when religious and social pressures made skull drinking unacceptable, people abandoned the practice relatively quickly. This suggests that humans are capable of moral evolution, of recognizing when traditions have outlived their usefulness, and of developing better ways to meet their psychological and social needs. The fact that skull cups now exist primarily in museums rather than dining rooms shows that cultural change is possible even for deeply embedded practices. The same psychological needs that skull cups once satisfied are now met through different means: competitive sports, video games, business competition, academic achievement, and countless other channels that allow people to experience victory, dominance, and power absorption without requiring human sacrifice. But the skull cups haven't entirely disappeared. They persist in our collective unconscious, in our horror movies and fantasy literature, in our metal band logos and video game iconography. We've sublimated skull drinking into symbolic form, maintaining its psychological appeal while eliminating its literal practice. The skull cup has evolved from functional object to cultural metaphor, representing our ongoing fascination with death, power, and the consumption of enemies. Perhaps the most important lesson from skull cup history is that human psychology contains potentials that can be expressed in radically different ways depending on cultural context. The same impulses that led ancient warriors to drink from enemy skulls can be channeled into artistic creation, scientific discovery, or social reform. The energy is the same. Only the expression changes. The skull cups remind us to approach historical judgment with humility. The people who drank from human skulls weren't fundamentally different from us. They were responding to their circumstances using the tools and beliefs available to them. Their practices seem horrific to us because we have different circumstances, different tools, and different beliefs. But the underlying humanity, with all its darkness and adaptability, remains constant. As we close this journey through the world of skull cups, consider this. Every human skull that was ever transformed into a drinking vessel belonged to someone who lived, loved, feared, and hoped just like we do. They became cups not because they were less human than us, but because they lived in times when human dignity was defined differently, when death was more present, and when survival required practices that we can now afford to find horrific. The skull cups are silent now, but their legacy lives on in every museum that houses them, every academic paper that studies them, and every moment when we're forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that human nature is far stranger, more adaptable, and more capable of both horror and beauty than we usually dare to admit. Tonight, when you go to sleep in your comfortable bed, drink a glass of water from your normal cup, and feel grateful for living in times when your dinnerware has never had a face. But remember the skull cups. Remember what they tell us about who we are, who we've been, and who we might become if circumstances ever change enough to make the unthinkable seem normal again. The skull cups are waiting in their museum cases, holding their secrets, teaching their lessons, and reminding us that the line between civilization and what we now call barbarism is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes, that's the most important lesson history can teach us, that we're all capable of more than we think, for better and for worse, depending on the world we happen to find ourselves living in. Thanks for joining me on this dark journey through human history. If this video made you think differently about the past, or about human nature, or about the cup you're drinking from right now, let me know in the comments. And remember, the next time someone complains about modern life being too complicated or stressful, you can remind them that at least their morning beverage doesn't come from someone's cranium. Sleep tight, and try not to think about skull cups. Though now that I've mentioned it, you probably will.